So welcome everyone. Welcome to this second edition of the World HandCOV'd series, where we talk about the impact of the pandemic on international security, and more specifically on security in Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian spaces. And before I provide you with more details, let's watch a small video that tells you something about this project. Yeah, welcome once again. This is the second edition of the series. Last week we spoke about the United States of America. Today we're going to focus on Russia. The world is handcuffed with COVID. Using this wordplay, we have come up with the name for the project. So we assume that as we're now living through a pandemic, lots of change might be taking place. And when we're through the pandemic, we might find the world and international security in a different shape. In order to understand what that shape might look like, we're going to look at what we call the pillars of international security. That is to say, core states and international organizations that are responsible for security in the Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian spaces. And today, as I already said, we're looking at Russia. Before we go into the substance, let me make the final technical and housekeeping announcement. We're going to have 3 working languages today, and those of you who need interpretation, please join our webinar on Zoom, and there you can find all the proper ways to listen to the discussion in the language you prefer. And the languages we are using are Russian, English, and German. But the rest of you are very welcome to continue watching on Facebook. So talking of the World HandCOV'd and Russian prospects in this world, today we have an all-star cast. Let me introduce our speakers for tonight. Let me begin with Dr. Tom Graham, who is Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and also Senior Advisor at Kissinger Associates. Tom, very warm welcome to you. We have Dr. Sergei Makedonov, who represents the Institute of International Studies at GIMO University, and who is also expert at our expert council of the Minsk Dialogue. We have Ms. Pilar Bonet, Moscow-based correspondent of El País, and one of the best-known journalists working on Russia and on the post-Soviet space. And also Mr. Leonardo Salvador, who represents the Moscow office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And this discussion will be mainly moderated by my colleague, Jakob Wallenstein, director of Belarus office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And before giving the floor to Jakob, I just want to thank our partners, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, once again. This project is being implemented by the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. So thank you very much. Jakob, the floor is yours, and we all look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, Eugenii, for the introduction and also for the cooperation. This is now the second session, and as the tradition that we have established in this project continues, we have also had 2 papers this week. That's 2 of our experts, which Eugenii just introduced, have put forward, which can be found, if you haven't read them yet, on both the CAS Belarus website and the Minsk Dialogue's website. Those 2 strategic insights, as we call them, follow the set of questions that we want to follow up during these 3 months that this project is going to go for. And today we're looking at the strategic dilemmas facing Russia in the post-corona world. There are 4 main questions for these papers, which will also structure today's discussion. Namely, first of all, what specific security and geopolitical circumstances does Russia find itself in at the time of the pandemic disruption? Secondly, What major security policy dilemmas is Russia facing now and is likely to face as the COVID crisis is over? Thirdly, how will the pandemic and its longer terms effects impact Russia's status and role in the international system? And fourthly, what strategic implications will the non-changing or the changing Russian role in the world have for Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security? So both papers can be found on our websites. We're going to start again by the two authors sharing the main findings and the main thesis from their papers in very short 5 minutes. And we're going to start with Dr. Markedonov. The floor is yours. We're looking forward to your input.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I will continue in Russian. I understand that we are free to speak any language here. I would like to clarify right away about how much time I would have for this speech.
So as we said, we would like to have the summary in 5 minutes of the main points and findings of the paper.
Okay, я понял, около 5 минут.
Okay, 5 minutes, then it's 5 minutes. The first thesis, without further ado, I can tell you that the pandemic effects and its influence on the international political processes it deserves the focus of everybody's attention. At the same time, there are two serious foci here. First, we're talking about the global trends, international processes, international economic processes behind these global trends. Whatever is happening in regions of the world and separate countries usually is of secondary importance, is not really studied properly. And what we, and you in particular, try to analyze specific players in this game is of utmost importance. Secondly, I think that all of us are held hostage of the novelty, I can say. Most of the publications saying that the world is going to be different, the world is different, it's changing. I would say that let us not haste with such conclusions. The pandemic is not over. We're still in the course of its unrolling. And speaking about post-coronavirus world, we're still living in the world of coronavirus. That's why to say that the current situation will break down the global architecture of the global European or regional security would be too early. What we can say here, we can say that it would be true about the context of Russia and other areas that the current pandemic has become a serious stress test for many countries, including for Russia. But no serious problems or new problems have been uncovered here. The first question that we can mention here, what happened before pandemic in the Russian context? It is obvious that Russia was unhappy. It happened quite a while ago, not in the year of pandemic, not with Putin, but even earlier than that. Russia has always been unhappy about the Europe-centric security model and the domination of the United States and the attempt to dominate in those areas which are of special interest to Russia. We're talking about post-Soviet areas, and Russia is the country whose interests, of course, are not limited by former Soviet Union countries, but these areas are of a special interest to it. And so that introduction would be true both before pandemic and after pandemic as well. It's not going anywhere. Speaking about special interests in the post-Soviet area, I can say that nothing is boiling down only to the competition between the United States and Russia. There are many other nuances at play here. The interests of immediate neighbors and other countries. Indeed, it is believed that Armenia and Belarus are more pro-Russian, Georgia and Ukraine are anti-Russian, but in their specific actions, there are many nuances and gray zones. Russia is a pro-NATO country, but the first Caucasian country that signed an agreement for free trade with China. Belarus, a country called pro-Russian, but as Belarus recognized Abkhazia and Ossetia. No, are they? And Belarus is competing quite seriously about the Eurasian integration. Let's look at pandemic. Let's see at measures undertaken by Russia and Belarus. They're quite different, strikingly different.
And in Russia, the victory parade has been postponed. In Belarus, not so. So these things say that the picture is more variegated for Russia. What pandemic has made more acute and what Russia is going to encounter in this situation, pandemic has put forward serious requests for shutting down the borders. One needs to be shut down to beat down the virus dynamics. Of course, this thing is related to many other things. In the Russian context, we're talking about the problems in relations with the Asian countries like migration. And it's quite a painful problem for us, which has economic, geopolitical dimensions, and I think also local or internal dimension, because migration, because of the shrinking down of the labor market, creates a lot of problems. And we're talking about generally integration structures. Now we're saying that we're shutting down, we're shrinking, but at the same time, there is a question of where those integration structures would be useful to us and where we can do something without Moscow. This isolationist request, some rhetoric to become more independent, puts Moscow before some dilemmas, how to behave under these circumstances. It is quite clear that Eurosec project and a CEO project needs to be relaunched, and one needs to be interesting for one's partners. And the pandemic is not going to enfeeble the interests of the former superpowers. They will remain with them. And the key problems of this new world situation, both international and regional security, remain the same. Russia now, I wouldn't say that Russia has any hope for quick breakthrough in their relations with the West, whereas there were such hopes after 2014 that they thought that the sanctions are the temporary thing. Now there are no such hopes. They believe that that the West is serious about the sanctions and they're for long. It has become a part of a new normalcy, new reality, and Russia is going to live with that. At the same time, any attempts of a pragmatic bilateral communication will continue, considering that many integrational things, not only in Eurasian but also European space, has shown how problematic they are. Here we have a new window of opportunity for Russia, how to play into bilateral relations, how to improve relations with different countries, how to change these relations. Of course, there are problems with China. China is the dynamically developing country everybody's talking about. China, where there is no China, China is planning conquests. So pandemic is unlikely to change radically those dilemmas that Russia already had. And China is at the same time a country which is opposing United States hegemony, and it is an asset. And economically, China is also interesting for Russia, especially in those areas which are of special interest to Russia. I'm talking about Central Asian countries. And it's obvious that China is not going to compromise its interests, and it's not going to become too sentimental about this or show mercy to somebody, and there will be a vicious competition in the future. The same would be true about other Eurasian partners. Russia finds it interesting to continue relations with Iran and Turkey, and no one of those named countries are happy with a monopolar world or the domination of the United States, but all of them are unhappy about this differently. All of them try to build their relationship differently, and most importantly is that among all those key players, Turkey, Iran, China, India, and Russia, all of them have their own internal problems, and among themselves they also have problems. So to consider that pandemic is going to unite them quickly based on some Eurasian solidarity, maybe such an idea would be interesting for Moscow. I agree with that, but I think it would be hardly feasible. So this is a range of problems that Russia had before the coronavirus and will continue to have after it. And the pandemic is unlikely to change it radically. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I can take them.
Thanks a lot for this input. Once again, I would like to recommend to our auditorium to read your publication also, which is online on both our websites, with the insight which focuses a lot on the Eurasian space. And this is a wonderful segue to my colleague Leonardo Salvador, who represents the Moscow office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and who is going to present the paper written by himself and Dr. Thomas Kunze, the director of the Moscow office, which puts more of a focus on the domestic view in Russia.
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Leonardo Salvador. I work at the CAS office in Moscow. This report has been prepared by me and Mr. Kunz, who is the head of our office in Russia. Okay, I suggest we now discuss the main bullet points of our document. First of all, allow me to remind you of the following. Russia, in the course of about 30 years, or right, 30 years ago, Russia was one big undiscovered land, and it had to focus on its own area and its immediate neighbors. It was the time of multipolar world, which was gone for Russia, and then the monopolar world started to reign. And Russia was viewed as a source for raw materials. But now we can speak about the advent of a new stage in the development of Russia. Now again, we're talking about the conversion from monopolar to multipolar world. We can consider this as a transition period of this history. We have and see many important aspects which are determining factors for us. Where is Russia now in this multipolar new formation? We believe that Russia has entered an important path for its future development. We have analyzed three potential ways for development. One of them would be the road towards Europe, United States, westward path. This path is related to many potential challenges. There are challenges and problems in Ukraine and Georgia, but without solving those problems first, this westward path for Russia is blocked. Still, Russia is Western culture-oriented country, and in Europe, there are many observers who speak about the sunset of Europe and the demise of the West. It is quite pronounced if we look at the Russian youth. If you go to Paris, Munich, or Berlin, for them it's still very important, and it's of higher priority than visiting, say, China. Next conclusion that we can make is continue in the role of the rogue state. It doesn't mean that there will be complete isolation. It would simply mean that Russia will determine its foreign policy depending on the circumstances at any given point in time. We can clearly observe it in Middle East. We can observe what is happening in terms of civil war in Syria, where different partners, independent of their own preferences, sometimes cooperate with each other, sometimes compete and fight each other. The same can be observed also in Libya. If Russia decides to walk its own path, neither westward nor eastward, then quite often we'll see such consequences in terms of the situationally predetermined policies, depending on what partner Russia will be building its relationship with. Because of the lost time in the past 25, 30 years, it will give some time to Russia not to be embroiled into a potential war between China and United States. Third path is eastward path. I'm talking about Chinawards path with all the consequences that lead to that. And I think that eastern part of Russia from Yakutsk to Kamchatka will get huge economic preferences if we're talking about amping of relationship with China, but with the economic growth, there will be some shifting of economic development foci for Russia. There will be a greater shift towards political dimension, and now we've seen Russia to be more oriented towards Western models of development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salvador, for this introduction. I found it particularly interesting also in your paper that this second scenario that you described even included the idea that Russia could become what you call the kingmaker between the United States and China. So whatever country they would choose to go with on specific issues could then, by the weight of Russia, achieve even a broader dominance globally. Thanks again to the two inputs. I would like now to give the floor to our two special guests for their comments. And I would like to start with Pilar Bonet to have a 5-minute comment on what you've heard from the two experts.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, first of all, I don't like terms like anti-Russian, pro-Russian, pro-American. And I think to begin with, I will start with a philosophical statement. The coronavirus should have teach all us that we are mortal, just to remember it, and that we live in a finite space and time. But this lesson doesn't seem to be learned, I think. So we can assume now that the world after the coronavirus will be very much the same as it was before the coronavirus. Having experienced this stress test about which Sergei has spoken, I do agree. But this stress test is a stress test in many, many directions. It's a stress test for democracy, for anti-democracy, for efficiency, and also for the wish or capacity of controlling the society in the future. This, in the case of Russia, I think that there are elements which can be used for that purpose in the future. And my idea is that Russia is now in a period of stagnation, politically speaking. This period of stagnation has been aggravated in 2014. Yeah, sorry, I can listen a translator, but I wouldn't like to. I don't want to listen.
For some reason now the German translator.
I switch off. This stagnation has been aggravated in 2014 by the annexation of Crimea and the military intervention of Russia in the Ukraine. And I think that being friend of Russia as it is my case, should be said, because it cannot be done as business as usually, and we turn page, and this 2014 doesn't exist. Yes, it did exist. It has consequences. We have to talk about it. But if there is a taboo in our relation, the relation will be vitiated forever. So Russia doesn't want to talk about 2014. It says, that's already done, guys. Let's go to something else. No. We will go to something else parallelly. Yes, because life is complex and we are not stuck to one single thing. But this is a taboo among us, and it's playing a role in the confidence between Russia and the West, and Russia and its allies. And that's where I go to Sergei's paper, who talks about the role of harmonizer of Russia among the former Soviet republics, today states of the community of international independent states or other organizations. The factor trust has been really spoiled. So it has to be recovered if we are interested in in keeping international relations. It is said now that coronavirus will play against globalization. I don't think it will be like this completely, because I think that we will have, at the end of the road, we will have a mixture of globalization, to which we cannot give up this globalization, and renationalization of different factors. And that goes not only for Russia, it goes for other countries, which would like to have the leverages to organize their life if there is another pandemic. Let's see what happened in Spain, for instance. You didn't have masks, you didn't have respirators, you didn't have anything. You have to ask for it to China. So part of the strategic medical industry should be kept in national borders. So we will see a mixture of nationalization and globalization in the future. I don't think Russia is a threat from outside. And I think Russia has still its imperial agenda, and refuses to see the small countries around it as independent and countries able to decide about their future. If they are let alone, as I understand from Sergei's paper, they would be organizing chaos. So maybe not, maybe they have to be let alone so that they can learn to live not only to damage Russia, but to be useful to Russia and to interact, because Russia needs interacting at another level with other countries in order to modernize. And what is happening now, and I will finish with that, we have an enormous contradiction between what is coronavirus telling us we are human, we are limited, we are going to die, and power, which wants to make himself eternal, the president eternal, by the possibility of being re-elected. So this is a very big contradiction. And I think that Russia has some internal agenda which has to do with itself, and we will all do together with our internal agendas. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the comment. And now for the final comment of the first round to Dr. Thomas Graham.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And thank you very much to Sergei and Leonardo for two very stimulating papers. I want to pick up on some of the comments that were made about China and develop it a little bit more in my remarks. Russia began to rebuild its relationship with China at the very late Soviet period, continued into the post-Soviet period for very good strategic reasons. It was seeking a commercial counterbalance to an over-reliance on European markets for trade and for direct investment. And it was looking to China as a counterweight to the United States to break the strategic triangle that the United States had manipulated in the 1970s and the 1980s to its advantage, but not necessarily to the advantage of Russia and China together. Now, this alignment with China, this rebuilding, accelerated in 2014 after the Ukraine crisis for reasons we're all familiar with. And that has deepened over the past 6 years, where Putin will say that the relationship with China is as best as it has ever been in history, that they're strategic partners, increasingly working on a range of security issues, economic issues, and other matters. Now, the problem that Russia faces and continues to face is how it maintains its strategic autonomy in today's world and in the world looking forward. And particularly, how does it maintain its strategic autonomy in a relationship with China, where all the asymmetries, demographic, economic, commercial, technological, I would argue security as well, are moving in China's direction. This is a problem that has been reinforced by the COVID crisis because of the intensification of the dispute between China and the United States, a concern that the world may be moving in a bipolar direction. And if it's a bipolar world, then China and the United States are going to be putting pressure on other countries to choose sides, that is, to limit their strategic autonomy. So the challenge Russia faces is how does it hedge against different developments in China while still not alienating China, a strategic relationship that is still a foundation of its foreign policy. Over the past several years, it has tried to integrate the Eurasian, the former Soviet space, as something of a hedge against China. It's worked with India and Japan. It's created organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, to do that. But none of these are really adequate to the longer-term challenge of maintaining strategic autonomy. I would argue that what Russia needs to do is normalize its relations with the West. That's where the balance will come from. Now, Pilar has already talked a little bit about Europe, Sergei as well. I think Russia's view is that the Europeans were going to, were going to cave on the sanctions much sooner than Russia would feel the effects of the sanctions. That hasn't turned out to be the case. Europe has demonstrated a great deal of unity in pursuing these sanctions, and there's very little evidence that that is going to break down in the near term. You look at the responses to President Trump's offer to bring Russia to the G7 summit in September this year. The Europeans are opposed, and the reason is because of Russian behavior in Ukraine, first of all, as well as continuing concerns about meddling in domestic affairs in Europe. So that's not going to change. Europe is not going to be a possibility. Russia also, I think, would like to normalize relations with the United States. That is what it says at the rhetorical level. But you see very few concrete steps being taken by Russia to indicate that it wants a better relationship with the United States. And here again, I think the Russian position is that the United States will come to recognize the value of Russia, see the need to normalize that relation for its own strategic needs. And that gets to the question of China. Russia would like to create a strategic triangle along the Kissingerian model of the 1970s with Russia at the pivot. Russia as the kingmaker in this relationship that can move from one side to the other side and affect the balance. That may be Russia's wish. The problem is that that carries no water in Washington at all. If you look at this relationship from Washington's perspective, the challenge that Russia and China poses to the United States strategically is no greater than the challenge that China poses alone. So there's no incentive to improve relations with Russia in order to deal with China. What the United States is trying to do is improve its relations with Japan, India, Vietnam, Australia, and other countries in order to constrain China's development. Would Russia be a benefit to that? Yes, but Washington is not going to go out of its way to bring Russia into that position. And that, I think, underlies the challenge that Russia faces going forward making itself attractive as a power that other countries want to have a closer alignment with.
Thank you very much for the comments. I would like to give the floor back to the two authors because they have been addressed and also partly criticized. Again, to make a follow-up comment, I see that Dr. Markedonov is already waiting for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Moderator, allow me to just 1 second. I'm going to fix some technical settings in my computer. First, I would like to thank my co-panelists for their very interesting speeches. I made numerous notes here. I can argue many of them. First thing to argue about in what Leonardo said. He said that in the 1990s, Russia was gone from the global arena. I would disagree with that. Russia showed itself quite actively in the 1990s as well, in a post-Soviet zone. Because of Russia, for instance, in 1997, an agreement on cessation of civil war in Tajikistan was signed. We're talking about multi-year civil war in Tajikistan, which was quite successfully stopped by Moscow. The same is true about Transnistria and Caucasus wars. 25 years have gone since then, and the only document that shows the peace treaty in Karabakh is the agreement signed with Russia. And Russia spoke about its concern of the monocentric world, not only with Putin. In 1994, Brussels adopted a decision on the expansion of NATO in December 1994. 2 days after that, the summit of the OSCE, Yeltsin openly says that Russia is not happy about this. This is a Cold War, a cold peace that came to replace the Cold War. Russia is opposing Western role in Bosnia, saying that any military interference of NATO is bad for European security. Russia is openly talking about this. The first crisis between the West and Russia happened not under Putin. It was in 1995 in Kosovo, and upon the initiative of Russia, all subsequent crises appeared upon the Western initiative in 2008 and 2014. Your next thesis, this 3 paths that or roads that Russia can choose, like in famous Russian fairy tales, when a famous Superman chooses a path to go to. I'd say that Western vector is totally blocked now. I'm referring to Pilar Bonet said that without turning the page of 2014, we're not going westward, and Russia is not going to play back then. This is for sure. If Russia collapses, and because of some catastrophic actions, weak Russian power agrees to replay the scenario of 2014, only under these circumstances it is possible. Any other power, even if Navalny becomes the president tomorrow, they will never give back Crimea. And Russia understands that Crimea would be only the first step. Then the question will be asked about Abkhazia, then about the military base in Transnistria, and then we'll be interested in the human rights in Dagestan and Chechnya. So without it happening, Russia chooses to walk its own path, understanding that the relations with the West needs to be continued. All these beautiful talks about the westward turn, Russia stands where it stands. So east or west, we still have borders everywhere. We border on the EU. We have trade relations in spite of the trade sanctions. United States remains to be superpower #1 and will continue our relations with the United States. But the Western partners need to realize that these relations must be equal. If Russia must follow some recommendations, then the relations will be exactly like they are at the moment. This is a matter of principle for us. We conduct our history not since 2014. Crimea is not the cause, but is not the reason, but the cause for us. We could discuss what was done wrong or right by Moscow. I don't consider the decisions made in 2014 faultless, but they were made under certain context and not in a vacuum. And those contextual prerequisites that happened before Crimea were not to the liking of Russia, but nobody wanted to listen to Russia, and we need to understand that. And I believe it is of great importance. That is why, if we speak about a Western vector of development, I doubt that will be acceptable. And the question is whether Russia is prepared to see West is prepared to see Russia like that. Speaking about China now, I'm not a China optimist here. I wouldn't say that we have friendship forever. Many of our experts and politologists who I talk to, they're the same people who in the 1990s were saying that the United States is going to make the sun arise and set. The same people are saying that it is China who is going to make the sun set and rise. Same people are changing their stories. I don't think we need to look at who is going to rise or set suns in the world, China or the United States. I think it would be a huge risk for Russia to embroil itself in the confrontation between the United States or China on anybody's side. We have our own game and we have our own interests, and we will follow them. And another concept which was voiced by Pilar Bonet about the independent states and whether Russia recognizes them or doesn't recognize them. Of course, Russia fully realizes that former Soviet countries are independent, but when we're told that we must respect the choice of those countries, this is a double-sided game. This is not one-way ticket. Other partners must also take into consideration the interests of Russia, and not only that Russia owes something to somebody. Russia cannot owe everybody. Somebody owes to Russia as well. And yes, they're independent, but then Georgia, you must be made responsible. Don't build your identity on, as we are, I will use the fat word, by trolling Russia. You shouldn't solve your economic problems at the cost of Russia. Let us be more responsible about that. When I visit Georgia and I visited Ukraine, I hope I will visit Ukraine again and again. I always said that problem of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova is not the presence of national interest, but the total lack. It would be much easier to work with Georgia for Russia if Georgia could solve its own national interests independently. Not like now, they have conflict between power and opposition. Where do they sign the agreement? Of yes, in the residency of US ambassador, Mr. Devner. He is the chief politician there. So you shouldn't ask these questions. When I mention the same statement in Moldova, Moldovan minister shook my hand. He said, "You're totally right. We are totally lacking our own national interests." When I speak about own national interests, it doesn't mean that Georgians, Moldovans, Ukrainians will totally agree with everything that we say. No, they will of course argue with us. They will disagree with us. There will be some collisions, but without the factor of the third or fourth force, these problems could be resolved much easier. And they were resolved much easier in the past. There was no NATO factor. Primakov brought Arzen to Tbilisi, and the peaceful process was there. And there were hopes also to resolve this problem of territorial integrity. Now the third, fourth external player appears. I'm not going to point fingers here. And a totally different situation emerges. And we're talking about total deterioration of the conflict. This is what I'm talking about here. So of course, respect toward small states should go hand in hand with respect toward the big superpowers like Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Pilar wants to comment directly. Switch on your microphone, please. The microphone is, yeah, there you go.
Okay. Is that on now?
Yes, it's on now.
No, I agree that we are confronted with a long and complex story, and interests of different actors should be taken into consideration. I'm not going to talk about any specific conflict. I only want to say several things. I think that Russia is still very sour because of the end of the Soviet Union, and it has not gone through the process of accepting several things. It's a long story. I also think that all the countries around Russia are different and have different biographies. It's not the same Abkhazia and Ossetia than Pridnestrovia or Crimea. Each conflict is different, yeah, and Russia has played different roles at different times, and they are not necessarily in the same range. Yeah? One thing was Primakov taking Artsakh to Tbilisi, yeah, and the other is Crimea 2014, not to be more explicit, yeah. And this is one thing. And can you tell me what is wrong? Just explain me. I am, let's say, I am come from another planet. You have two parts in conflict in one country. And the American ambassador, of the Swedish ambassador, of the Swiss ambassador, try to get these two parts to reconcile themselves, not having a commission for that service. What is wrong with that? I don't understand. I never understood that. When someone says, this is an internal matter of one country, to a certain point, because all countries have signed international treaties and agreements. So what is wrong with an ambassador X trying to help two parts to solve their internal problems? What is wrong? Just tell it to me. I don't understand. I don't get it.
Can I respond?
Very quick response, yes.
I am asking you to respond, Sergey.
Нет, но ответ предельно прост. Важно понимать, что любой посол представляет интерес.
That any ambassador, first of all, protects and represents the interests of his or her country, and the regulation cannot be abstract. If it would be a Swiss ambassador, I would be more happy about the situation, because Swiss politicians are not talking about the danger of the Russian economic presence in Georgia, for instance. I visited Georgia a year ago. The same day, Georgia was visited by Mr. Carpenter, one of the crucial or key personages accompanied by Biden, who's saying that Georgia and China Russia and China are false friends of Georgia. Maybe it should be Mr. Carpenter, who is not an elected.
Because I already see, just 1 second, I see Pilar already wanted to respond. Please keep this as short as possible, because this is a very particular, interesting question, but it's going to take the time that we have. So please, Sergey, finish the statement, but don't make this a conversation on this issue.
Yeah, just one thing, not to make it a conversation, but I think that I propose a conversation about stereotypes and in reinforcing identities, so that everyone is able to defend their interests and don't get completely upset because the ambassador of the United States is not God, my God. My ambassador, you don't have to fulfill what he says or what she says. Why don't you say, go to heaven if you want? Why can you not accept that Georgians can say no to America? You think that they are unable to say no? You think that all allies are unable to say no? If they are unable to say no, that's a big problem, I think. It's a big problem.
So, Sergey, do you want to finish your statement?
Ну, собственно говоря, основные...
In fact, the principal things I've already mentioned. Once again, there is such a thing as a reputation. When a country has a reputation of acting in a particular area, and we know what it can lead to, if we're talking about ambassador from Sweden, Switzerland, or Norway, they don't have such a reputation capital. So if it were a Norwegian capital, we would have nothing against it.
Okay, let me turn over to Mr. Salvador again, who even raised his hand, because you pointed out these three scenarios and we had comments on these scenarios. So what would be your take? I think none of us see Russia joining the European Union in the very immediate future, and none of us see them becoming only the junior partner of China. So in your assessment, probably what the discussion has brought so far is that the center scenario might be the most realistic one, that Russia will have a position of maintaining as much sovereignty as possible. But how do you see this what does it mean for the relations with China and the European Union, and how is the ongoing pandemic influencing this? Microphone.
Ja, hallo? Jetzt bin ich hörbar. Ja, es gab ja Anmerkungen auf das Gesagte zu der Zeitepoche, als Russland ausgefallen ist. Ich hatte ja klar auch gesagt, es war beschränkt auf Russland und die nähere Umgebung. Also früher gab es immer diesen Begriff nahes Ausland, weil auch die Konflikte, die Sie ja angeführt hatten, der Bürgerkrieg in Tadschikien, der Transnistrien-Moldawien-Konflikt, der Krieg um Karabach, die Konflikte in Georgien, das waren ja alles Konflikte auf dem Gebiet der ehemaligen Sowjetunion. Was wir mit unserer These meinten, außerhalb dieses Raumes der ehemaligen Sowjetunion und etwas näheres Umfeld, war Russland in diesem Zeitraum nicht aktiv. Also in Afrika, in Lateinamerika, auch größtenteils im Nahen Osten, hatte während dieses Zeitraums Russland keine Rolle gespielt. Also das war die These nochmal zu der
One second,
also die Erklärung.
I think the interpreter cannot hear us. Okay, we're back.
Wait.
Continue.
Gut, also kann ich, gut. Also war das jetzt alles vernehmbar oder soll ich das nochmal kurz zusammenfassen? Alles richtig, ja? Gut, weiter. Ja, kurz nochmal auf den Kollaps. Natürlich wünscht sich niemand einen Kollaps. Ich halte es auch für unrealistisch. Ein Kollaps würde nur ein geopolitisches Vakuum verursachen, was so niemand braucht. Ganz sicher nicht der Westen. Aber ich halte das auch für unrealistisch. Kommen wir zu den konkreten Fragen. Es sieht auch für uns danach aus, dass das realistischste Szenario die eigene Position ist. Mit, wie auch Herr Graham das gesagt hat, wir hatten das auch im Thesenpapier, dass Russland vielleicht die Rolle eines Königsmachers in den chinesisch-amerikanischen Konflikt einnimmt. Unser Kollege aus Moskau hat ja auch gesagt, keine Einmischung in den Konflikt China-USA. Wir hatten das auch gesagt, also das wäre ein fundamentaler Bestandteil dieses Weges, falls Russland den einschlägt. Wir kennen das ja aus den letzten multipolaren Szenarien der Weltgeschichte im Vorfeld des Ersten Weltkrieges. Sind die USA beispielsweise sehr spät, erst 1917, in den Krieg hineingetreten. Wir wissen nicht, wie alles sich entwickelt hätte, wenn das vorher geschehen wäre. Natürlich haben wir jetzt ein etwas verändertes Szenario, aber nur die Analogie in einer multipolaren Welt. Wir sehen auch beispielsweise, Frau Bonnet, Sie kommen ja aus Spanien, die Situation Spaniens vor dem Ersten Weltkrieg. Nach der Niederlage im US-amerikanisch-spanischen Krieg war Spanien derart geschwächt, dass es erstmal eine Phase der eigenen Reorientierung durchlaufen musste. Da gab es ja dann die Generation der neuen Generation del 98 und alles. Also das war ja, genau. Also, und es gibt diesen Zeitraum, dass bestimmte Länder für eine Weile erstmal sich selbst besinnen müssen. Wir würden natürlich eher eine proeuropäische...
There are certain time periods when countries need to reorient themselves, and a lot of words is spoken about the conflicts in Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, but all these conflicts are solvable. There are approaches, there are Minsk Accords, and we shouldn't forget about the prestige that the West has and the cultural proximity between these countries. Russia is an important cultural factor. Cultural factor remains to be unchanged. Russia will remain to be a European country, just like Germany. Of course, maybe something can change in, say, 2,000 years, but from our standpoint, the future of European future will remain unchanged. Mr. Graham also mentioned that the United States also is interested in the Russia and United States relations. Let me put it differently. The most recent move about the strategic arms treaties, Dmitry Medvedev made a statement about that. And if we look at this from a geopolitical point of view, if we look at Middle East, there are cross points for cooperation between the West and Russia. If, for instance, we consider the situation with Iran, we all know from history that Iran has always been a rival of Russia. We know Russian-Persian wars. We know about the attempts in the 1990s, how Iran wanted to put its influence on Tajikistan because of ethnic proximity. But if we look at Russia and Iran act as allies with Assad, but all of them individually on their sides. And there is certain rivalry there between them as well. And the influence or attempts of Iran to exercise its influence on the Middle East, or the influence of Shiite population, are not within the interests of Russia. In Libya, for instance,
eine ganz interessante Situation. Frankreich
Russia is closer to General Haftar. Here we have an interesting situation when France and United Arab Emirates are against, whereas Italy is closer to Tripoli. And this is what we mentioned in the past, this changing alliances and interests. Whoever is an ally in Syria not necessarily can be an ally in Libya. We spoke about the former Soviet Union states, the countries which are allies under certain circumstances act in accordance with their interests, first of all. And this same idea reflects the multipolarity of the world. If we step back into history and see what happened before World War I, I do not imply, of course, that we're on the eve of a new world war now. But if we look at the cooperation between Serbia, Bulgaria, and Austria-Hungary, and a few years after that, Serbia was first on the one side, then it switched sides. But in the first situation, they were cooperating, and then they didn't cooperate. And there are many facts, historical facts like this. So anything is possible, like Russia-Bulgaria, for instance. Sometimes they did cooperate, sometimes they didn't. And again, this is a factor that we must consider.
Thank you, Mr. Salvador. I was looking at the time that we have. I would like to turn back to Dr. Graham again, because we've been talking a lot now how things are not going to change, how Russia's interests are going to be the same, and how the geopolitical situation might change over 2,000 years, but not over the time of a pandemic spread. So my question would be, what is your take on the immediate effects of the corona pandemic under two aspects? First of all, how Russia has been trying to use its soft power now by supplying countries and neighbors with equipment, and also with the internal dealing with the virus. And secondly, what we see is some impulses that countries are trying to rebuild, or are thinking now about rebuilding the economy to be greener. There's the European Green Deal, which is being launched at the moment, that energy supplies should be greener, less focused on fossil fuels, which will have a big effect on Russia's economy. How do you think these trends, which are now starting or speeding up, might change Russia's position as a global power?
Right, I think Russia faces a very difficult situation in maintaining itself as a major power over the long term for some of the reasons that you've indicated. Russia has tried to build up its soft power by providing supplies to certain countries to deal with the pandemic. But you've seen what the response has been in much of the West to that, and certainly in the United States. It hasn't been widespread demonstrations of sympathy for Russia or even gratitude for Russia for those. Much more of the focus has been on what Russia has been doing in order to exacerbate the discord in Europe and in the United States, role that it might have played in spreading disinformation about the virus. Now, I don't want to get into a discussion of how important a factor that has been, but I'm just indicating that's a reflection of the prevailing attitudes in Europe and the United States about Russia, and it has some implications for the ability to normalize relations at this point. I think you're absolutely right. If you look over the long term, the growing concern about climate change, the need to reduce the level of fossil fuels is a major challenge to Russia, in part because so much of its economy is based on fossil fuels, oil and gas in particular. So how is it going to, or where is it going to find the other resources it needs that it can sell abroad that are going to allow it to remain competitive well into the 21st century? And let me just make one final point. Sergei had said that one of the things that Russia is considering when it looks at United States and China is how you remain above the battle, which may be a desirable position to be in, but it's very difficult to stay out of the competition at this point, in part because the competition between the United States and China covers a whole range of not only military issues, but more importantly, socioeconomic and technological issues. The decisions you make as to what technology to develop, 5G, for example, already compels you to make a choice between China and the West. There'll be other novel technologies coming on board as well. And unless Russia develops them themselves and sets the standards, is going to be choosing between technologies that are developed in China and technologies that are developing in the United States. So I think Russia is going to have to make choices. It's going to have to not choose sides, but it's going to have to pursue a very delicate diplomacy if it wants to maintain its strategic autonomy and not find itself too closely aligned with one country or the other.
Thank you very much. I have one last question as a moderator to all of you, which I would like to ask you to answer as briefly and concisely as possible, because we also have a set of questions from the audience. And this question will be, how do you think the developments that we've discussed in this online event now will influence the situation in Central and Eastern Europe, and what will be your piece of advice to the countries of Central Eastern Europe in order to maintain a secure and safe situation? Maybe we start with the lady, Pilar.
Well, I think that each country should be well advised to reinforce national mechanism to be able to rely on its own forces, not as isolationism, but as responsible people, responsible communities who are able to solve their problems as much as possible, not giving up globalization. That would be my lesson from the coronavirus.
Thank you. Sergei, what is your advice?
I would have formulated it in the following manner. The current situation has has made more relevant the request for pragmatism. The previous talks about some abstract values, be it Eurasian or European or pinings for the old Soviet Union, this is about nothing. We need to be more pragmatic now. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Leonardo.
Ja, ich denke, es ist noch zu früh, um dazu eine Einschätzung zu treffen. Man wird das
I believe that it's too early now to make any assessments or give any advice.
Okay, so we'll wait. And finally, Thomas.
Yeah, let me just agree with what Sergei and Pilar said. I think they're both right. That countries have to develop their own resources to take care of themselves in crisis like this, particularly in initial phases. They need to be more pragmatic. But I would also hope that the countries of East and Central Europe would also realize that the long-term future actually is in developing the mechanisms within the European community that will lead to a more equitable resolution of pandemics as they arise, and it won't leave each country alone to deal with the crisis.
Okay, thank you. So let us turn to the questions we have received from the audience. I count 5 + 1 at the moment. Please, if you have any more questions, the people that are watching this conversation, please use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom line in Zoom. You can ask your question there. And those who follow us on Facebook, please write your questions into the Facebook comments, and then our technical moderator will copy them into this function for me so I can see them in the same place. We have the first question, which is directed to Pilar. What conditions could help Russia understand post-Soviet countries as independent actors?
Well, I think its own experience and the experience of interaction with them. I mean, life is a process of learning, and I don't think that Russia is unable to learn. It has to go through a period of its history. Spain went through a period of its history. Leonardo has talked about that, and Russia has to do the same. And we need Russia, but Russia needs us. So we'll find a way. I hope, if we don't destroy each other before that, I hope we will find a way.
Thank you. The second question goes to Leonardo. I think it's actually a double question. It comes from like almost all of the questions, as I see from our friend Denis Bukonkin from Minsk. The question is, why couldn't you imagine that Russia can be the center of a USSR 2.0? And he specifies this a new ideology of gathering post-Soviet countries under the wing of the Russian Federation.
Wie gesagt, also wenn sich jetzt UdSSR 2.0 auf das also auf eine
the USSR 2.0
beziehungsweise eine
were about just a larger federation structure or some other structure, then why not?
Etwa, man konzentriert sich jetzt, Alleingang, wie gesagt, ist ja meinten wir nicht Isolation, einfach auf das nähere Umfeld mit Kasachstan, mit Weißrussland, in den Raum. Wenn sich jetzt UdSSR 2.0 auf eine ideologische Komponente stützt, dann verneine ich die Frage. Wie gesagt, also das hängt jetzt etwas davon ab, was damit gemeint ist.
I think the next question also goes to you, Leonardo. What are the main trends in relations of Russia with Germany since 2014?
Starting from 2014, of course, many things have changed and relations are greatly aggravated by the developments of that period. And the main trend here, I would have described it as follows. In the longer term, we're talking about restoration and pacification, normalization of the situation. We realize that there are many factors at play. It would be hard to list all of them here. There are still many unsolved questions, like Nord Stream pipeline project. But the main trend here is still directed at resolving conflicts.
The next question is not directed to somebody directly, but I would think this is a question that would be fit for Tom. What would closer EU-China relations mean for Russia, and could Macron's ideas for a better relationship between the European Union and Russia still be considered relevant? a question from Tony van der Tocht from Netherlands.
I think absolutely. You know, one of the challenges going forward is that despite the conflict at the moment, that the EU and Russia do need to normalize their relationship. It makes tremendous strategic sense for both as they compete in I think, a much more highly competitive world as they face powers like the China and the United States. Now, they all want to maintain their strategic autonomy. They don't want to choose sides. And one of the ways to do that is by maintaining good relations with as many countries as possible. Now, Russia may still lean towards China. The EU may still lean towards the United States. I would think that would be the way it would be. But in a normalized relationship, it creates for more balance in the overall relationship between Brussels and Washington, between Moscow and Beijing. So how you get to the normalization of relations, I think, is a challenge for both Russia and the EU. And Macron's ideas are a starting point, but obviously need to be developed much more fully and need to be debated more fully in Europe itself.
Thank you. There are two questions to Sergei. One, do you think that the conflict between Russia and Belarus are somehow related to the fact that Belarus is trying to pursue its own interest? And the second one, maybe I ask both of them. There are conflictuous relations between Russia with both Ukraine and Georgia. Do you think that the West had a role in this?
Ну, давайте начнем с определений, да?
Allow me to start with setting up the definitions, because we need to define things first. As Descartes said once, we don't see any conflict between Russia and Belarus. This is not a conflict, but contradiction. Contradictions have existed ever since the existence of the Union State of Russia and Belarus. These two partners, when signing the Union State Agreement, had different motivation to begin with. They had dissimilar views on the size, tempo, speed of integration, and the ratio of sovereignty and integration. This is a norm. This is not a conflict. We can be saying that Russia has difficult relations with Turkey, but this is not a conflict. They have broad differences on many questions, but it's not a conflict. Like the United States and Israel also had some misunderstandings, but this is not a conflict. So we do have contradictions, but they're not conflicts, and it's quite normal, and these contradictions will continue. It's not only related to relations between the heads of states, although they do spice up things when they do some rhetoric exercising toward each other. So such contradictions will continue. I expect that in a post-Soviet area in general, new independent states are quite jealous about the sovereignty, and Russia, of course, as well. An integration union means that some part of your sovereignty should be shared. You need to make errors and mistakes before you make it work. So it's quite a work in progress, I would call it. I don't think it is a conflict situation. Speaking about interests, does anybody doubt that Moscow considers or recognizes that Belarus undertakes its own sovereign policy? Of course it does, and we recognize and respect that. But it's always good when the foreign policy of your union state member is more understandable to you. It's quite normal. Like United States wouldn't want to have more independent Turkey. So it's quite normal thing. Speaking in response to the second question about Ukraine, Georgia, and the role of the West, maybe. These problems do have Western dimension. I wouldn't say that West created these problems. I want to be understood correctly here. When we speak about Maidan in Ukraine, the first or the second Maidan, I fully realize that it's not like the United States arrived there, gave them some free cookies, and Maidan erupted. No, it didn't work like that. But certain sympathies, not just sympathies, but the level of statements, but also actions did happen on the West side. And this sympathies, this interferences to different levels made that conflict more acute and spiced it up, as I said previously. The same would be true about Georgian situation. If we imagine that all of a sudden the United States wakes up and say that we're not interested in post-Soviet countries at all, we're not going to support neither Georgia nor Ukraine. Forget it. Of course, Russia will continue to have its problems with Georgia and Ukraine. We have our own agendas, we have our own contradictions, but the participation of the West here, which was quite unilateral, the way I see it, and which was restraining Russia, preventing Russia from developing, made it more acute. And the last thing to say here, dear colleagues and friends, we need to understand that there are no such abstract things as abstract world. When we say that, say, Russia or United States came there and they made peace somewhere, such superpowers make peace always within their interests. People say that if there will be no Russian domination, everybody would be happy. No. Whenever somebody leaves a space, somebody fills it in, like United States or China or somebody else. When we say that Swaziland and the United States have the same level of sovereignty, I disagree with that. It's not my first year living in this world. I think they have different level of sovereignty. Of course, there will be different domination, and we would like to see Russian domination to a certain level. In Thomas Graham's publications, he spoke about strategic culture, about strategic depth, and Russian concern in its geography. It was true about the past, it is true about present and the future. It will be true with Mr. Navalny, Ivanov, Petrov, whoever will be the future president in Russia. And whoever will respect such reasoning, Russia will be recognized as our valuable partner. Thank you.
Even future questions or even more questions, but most of them relate to China, which I think is perfect to keep in the back of our heads for next week's session, which will focus on China. But I don't think that after next week, the China topic will be dealt with, but I think it will be something that will be accompanying us throughout the rest of the series. So we've already passed the time that we set for this discussion, making up for the first minutes that we lost due to technical issues. I would like to thank all of our speakers again very, very much for your contribution today, for this panel, for making this a success. And I would like to again point out that you can find the two publications that we've discussed today on both Minsk Dialogues and CAS Belarus website. Thank you, and hereby I give the floor back to Eugenii, who will present us with the takeaways and summary of today's session.
Many thanks for all the speakers. It's been a great discussion, and of course, as always, time flies quickly, and we still have a lot to discuss, but that's probably the essence of this project. And from what I understand, our audience has been very representative. We have members of parliament, ambassadors, experts from quite a number of countries, which also seems to indicate that there is quite some interest in these strategic discussions. But before we start talking about next week's topic, let me indeed focus on a couple of takeaways. Lots of important points have been made, so probably I'll have to skip quite some of them, but the ones I want to stress is, first of all, we see a lot of things being accelerated due to the pandemic, but probably we're not talking about a fundamental change. So as Sergei put it, this looks like a stress test, but not a new phenomenon. And of course, while we're assessing the stress test, we shouldn't be focused on cliches, but rather on the difficult and complicated pictures around us. Of course, lots of scenarios can be ahead of us, and of course, we'll see which one will prevail. Most probably, as is always the case, or usually the case, a bit of every scenario might be out there, and some other game-changing moments might make unimaginable things happen. I think it is crucial what Tom said about the need for Russia to preserve its strategic autonomy amidst this growing competition between China and the United States. And of course, we can all observe lots of asymmetries which are defining this adaptation by Russia and will probably define further adaptation in the future. And as Russia most probably wants or prefers to be a kingmaker in this, as Tom put it, Kissingerian triangular, we should keep in mind some difficulties for doing that. And I think it was a very important insight from the American continent that many in DC do not really see this combined potential of China and Russia as very much different from the potential of China alone. And as Tom put it, sometimes many people in DC are more focused on Japan and its future role in the big geopolitics rather than on Russia. Pilar said that all countries around Russia have different biographies, and this should in some way be driving not only Russian foreign policy, but what is going to happen in the post-Soviet space. And it's difficult not to agree with this, especially for us sitting here in Minsk. Also, it will probably be very difficult for Russia to stay out of the US-China confrontation, as Tom put it, because at some point it might be the case that whatever we deal with, a choice will have to be made. And when tensions are so high and when the relations are so electricized, then even a small choice, which used to be all about economy, suddenly turns out to be political. And I think I will end with Pilar's quote, "We need Russia and Russia needs us." I think that's the most important takeaway of this discussion, which will continue to shape our analysis and our discussions as we proceed. So please stay tuned for other discussions and other papers which will be part of this project, the World HandCOV'd. And as Jakob has already announced, next week we are talking about China. The speakers and the papers will be out early next week. Thank you very much. It's been a great honor. Thanks to all the speakers.
And especially to our poor interpreters who are really struggling to follow with this conversation happening in 3 languages at an immense speed.
Yeah.
Sorry again for not standing on the break more. Incredible job. You can find this discussion on our YouTube channel as of early next week, probably by the latest, if you want to follow up in English. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you.
До свидания.
Bye-bye.